Hi, everyone. This is Jamie Henkel from PFLAG National, and thank you so much for joining us today for Something to Talk About Live. As I said, my name is Jamie. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Learning and Inclusion Manager. I am joining you from Portland, Oregon this afternoon, and I am very, very happy to introduce Jean Marie Navetta, who's the fearless leader of the Learning and Inclusion Department here at PFLAG.
Hello, Jamie. Thank you so much for getting us started, and welcome everybody to this week's Something to Talk About Live. My name is Jean Marie Navetta. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And to this week, we are going to be talking about Reddit, which is always an interesting conversation. So for those of you who would like to participate in the discussion, you certainly can via the chat. Comments on whatever feed that you are using. But if you would like to download the article, what you want to do is go to straightforequality.org. And if you just look at the box at the bottom, there is a link to the discussion series. And that's where you will be able to download a link to the article, as well as the questions that we're going to use to discuss today. So today's article is Queer Subreddit Attacks Are Forcing Moderators to Demand Action. It appeared in Now This News by Kavish Harija. I am going to bring in two of my colleagues from PFLAG National to help with this conversation, two people who are extremely excited to talk Reddit. First, Liz Owen, our Director of Communications, and Jamel Dooley from our chapter engagement team. So if you are a PFLAGger, you probably know Jamel from working on your chapter stuff, and Liz from promoting your chapter. So welcome, my friends. I am so happy to see you here.
Great to be here.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you. And so I want everybody to know that we did a little bit of prep on the article today. And when we got on the conversation to start the conversation, we were literally in three completely different places. So I'm so excited about dissent today. So the article actually, it goes into talk about a very specific incident that happened recently, which happened in April. And it had to do with what it was called a brigade attack, which is when a bunch of people organize essentially to attack a subreddit. And it was aimed at subreddits having to do with LGBTQ people. There were a couple of different variations on this. And the volume at which this happened was kind of unprecedented. And it, in fact, triggered a lot of actions. And one of those actions were that moderators, several hundred of them, actually requested that Reddit do something to help them moderate because the situation got so extreme. And we'll talk about some of those details as we get into it. So I want to start with our first question for both of you, because this is actually where we hit our first disagreement, which made me so happy. So the article does describe a brigade attack on queer subreddits in April. And this was, as we said, it was more aggressive than what was typically seen. There were over 11,000 comments, and most of them were negative. So my first question to you is, what do you think is driving these extremely intense attacks? What's behind it?
Jamel, you want to start?
Sure. I'll go first. I mean, like, at the most basic parts, like we're living in a steam engine, right? Everyone's sitting at home. We're using technology as a means of connection, as a means of escape. You know, we sit on our cell phones 15, 20 hours a week doing whatever. So I do think some folks are bored, but just as we'll get to with some of the other questions, you can use that time to be productive, you can use that time to be positive, or you can use that time to get in some mess. And I think as we've seen, some folks have chosen to use that energy, some of this restless energy to be negative.
Yeah. And Liz, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's a combo platter of the moment that we're in, but I think we have been in a 3.5-year moment. PFLAG is not a political organization, but it is a highly politicized time. And when you see bad behavior coming from places, you don't typically see it coming from a particular colored house in a particular district near Virginia. Have I said enough?
Between Virginia and Maryland?
Yeah, sort of there in that general area, I think, but not just there, and it didn't just start there and it didn't just start then, but I think it opened the gateway to a lot of other people. I also think there's something about the protection of everybody being distanced and online. I've seen many memes over the years that sort of imply you would never talk in person to people the way you talk to them.
Right.
especially on Reddit.
Do you think that anonymity drives some of that? Because that is one of the things that makes Reddit different from some of the other social media feeds, and that people can take on a higher level of anonymity. Do you both think that that is a factor here?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about like our interactions just out and about. Like, you know, you face to face, there's a different decorum for the way that you ask questions, you interact, the social norms. But when you're online and you have the anonymity, there's lesser repercussions for, you know, dropping an F-bomb, which is why 400 or 500 people decided that it was appropriate, you know, on this platform. So I do think anonymity on the internet has positive and negatives. Like the positive,
Right.
It allows for us to explore and ask questions that we may not be comfortable asking at work or in whatever social setting. But also, like anonymity sometimes gives people at least an essence or illusion of power that they may not use responsibly.
Yeah.
Although I do have to say that there have been some things happen in person lately where I'm like, that is literally a live action Reddit that I am watching unfold on video right now. Like there's some aggressive behavior that we used to see anonymously in places like Reddit where now it's just, and catch it all on camera too.
And well, I mean, and Reddit happens to be one of those examples of where social media actually has gone into the real world. I mean, there was the Pizzagate situation in 2016, where an absolutely ridiculous, offensive rumor and theory, you know, conspiracy theory was started, which actually inspired someone to actually go into a place with a gun in the District of Columbia. So there are definitely, we're seeing some of this carryover. So it's not just that you're seeing Reddit-like behavior. Sometimes, Liz, I think we are actually seeing some of those behaviors actually happening. So we've definitely seen this scale up. I mean, we've talked about people being isolated, and that probably pushed a lot more people online. People are using social media a lot more because of what's going on, to Jamel's point. I think there's a lot of frustration going on. And to Liz's point, we are in an incredibly hostile political climate. And that is a huge challenge. And I think sometimes it gives license to people's behavior. So that sort of flips the conversation over to, what is the responsibility of organizations like Reddit, like some of these social media companies that are out there, to protect both the moderators and the users? And I want to talk about the burden on the moderators too, because we actually got into this in our prep call about how this is a huge ask of the people moderating the conversations too. And as both of you have both been in places like that, you know what that means. And I also want to ask you both, what do we think are the reasonable guidelines for behavior? Because I would say that all three of us are pretty extreme in our belief of free expression and free speech. And yet this was a perfect example of where, sort of unfettered, that had some really traumatic impact for people. So first, I want to hear from both of you about, what do you think kind of are the responsibilities of these social media companies themselves to protect people?
Yeah, so I said all of them. I think it's the responsibility of the platform to at least do the bare minimum and create a framework for its users to, you know, be safe and access the platform in a way that will be safe.
Right.
It's the users that give the platform the lucrativeness so that they can make money from ads. It's the users that make the platforms popular. It's the, you know, platforms with Facebook, 1 billion profiles. Well, it's the users that help you, you know, create that, you know, that headline. So I think that it's an exchange, right? So if you're gonna, you know, laud all of these things or tout all of these things about the users, like, you should at least do your due diligence and protect them.
Mm-hmm.
As it pertains to rules, I would say no hate speech. Like, we don't want to minimize your ability to, like, ask questions. We don't want to minimize your ability
Right.
to have free speech, but, like, you know, no hate speech, no isms, so no racism, no homophobia, no transphobia. Like, I think these are, you know, the foundational things that should exist, you know, on these platforms. It's like a classroom. Like, you can't go into a classroom and openly, you know, do these things.
Yeah.
So how is this online space different?
Yeah. Liz, what about you? What do you think when it comes to some of these guidelines and protections? And also, I definitely want to make sure that we're talking about how this affects the moderators too.
It's interesting because I agree with everything Jamel said, and what I was going to address was how it affects the moderators. I remember there was a story, I think we're in March 81st today, but I'm trying to remember when it was from. But there was a story that really talked about the effect, the health effect on people. I think it was Facebook was the platform. Talking about people how to moderate speech and moderate moderators, and how deeply and negatively it was impacting their health. To have to sit and just read this kind of speech like all day long. That's their job. And, what kind of guidelines can be put in place to also help and support the moderators who do that work. I've been at PFLAG for a little over 10 years now. And I work very closely with Facebook, and I work a lot with them on guidelines, and it's really challenging, setting those guidelines. We have a really clear belief about what is hate speech. Yeah. Not everybody agrees.
Right.
And there is, how do you moderate moderately so that you're not curbing free speech, but you're also not allowing it to be whatever the online version of running into a theater and screaming fire is. Like, what is that balance?
Exactly. Because, there is documentation showing that, as we've gone into deeper quarantine and sheltering in place, we have seen an increase in trauma among LGBTQ people, particularly among LGBTQ youth, who often are having their experiences online because they can't leave their homes. And they are in these environments where, quite literally, and I actually just saw a friend of mine posting about an experience her son was having, people are telling young people to go kill themselves, that the best thing you should do is go kill yourself. We're not just calling people names, but people are being really directive. And as we know, when people are in crisis, that literally constitutes a crisis in these situations. So I think it's tricky. And I think you're right. We both want to respect, we all want to respect sort of this free exchange of ideas. And for many of us, the answer to problems with free speech is more free speech. And yet, in practice, it has not necessarily looked that way. It looks like, in some case, 1,400 posts, none of which were very nice about people who are LGBTQ. And that is a tremendous volume of things. So I want to get into sort of the practical. So this is where we sort of disagreed when we were getting into our conversation earlier today, which was about, what do we do about these spaces? So we all certainly have a lot of choices when it comes to the social media that we are using, what platforms we choose to use, the extent to which we choose to use them, and how we choose to use them. So given that, I think we can all agree there are some places that are probably a little bit safer or more secure or more inclusive than other places. Should we, in fact, be encouraging people who are LGBTQ, or I would say anyone who, kind of is in a group that is being marginalized and particularly victimized right now, should we be suggesting that people just avoid some of these spaces and go to other spaces? And sort of the other side of that, is, can you give examples of spaces that you think are great? And if you disagree with this, let's argue, because I'm so excited about this question.
She was ready to throw down literally from the minute this
Already.
It's going to be awesome. Let's go. Okay, let's go first.
So I obviously was on one pole of the spectrum. So I'm an avid Redditor. I use Reddit every day. I'm very experienced on the platform. One thing I appreciate about them is their karma system. So your ability to reward people for being interactive, for giving quality, good advice, and reprimanding people who don't do so good things, or people that will troll you on the platform. I think that's a good safeguard. As it pertains to the question, though, no, I don't think that LGBTQ folks should avoid using these spaces. Historically, once again, LGBT people have always had to fight to create space and to be heard. And I don't see the internet being any different. But also, I think there's more to gain from accessing these online, platforms than there is to use. As we talked about during our planning, there is a subreddit for everything. So I go to Reddit to learn things, to read about my favorite shows, and to escape. But if I want to know about nuclear fission, I can find a Reddit about nuclear fission. If I want to try a new recipe, there's a Reddit for that. So that gives LGBT people an opportunity or a space to connect with other LGBT people, which is power for us. So I think when it comes to creating space online, it's really important for us to develop enclaves or groups of people that we know are reputable, people that we know that we can be our true selves with, and you create that space online. And I think it's the same for Facebook and Facebook groups or Twitter and Twitter lists. Like every platform has a way of doing that. But I think it would be egregious for LGBT folks to flock away from a platform because we got some hate. Like, I don't think that's the right thing to do.
Okay. All right. Liz, talk to me.
I'm in the middle. I want to know what you think. Are you on the total opposite end of the spectrum?
Oh, no, I want to hear your opinion first. It makes it much more interesting.
I am the fulcrum of the seesaw. Did I say a keyword? I think it's hard to advise people to stay away from or flock to any particular platform. I really think it's a personal decision. And the truth is, there are some platforms where on any given day, there can be wonderful things happening. And the next day, that same page can have horrible things happening. And I think it's a really personal decision as to what a person can tolerate. You know, I think there are people who can dive into those subreddits that are, for me, would be traumatic and torture. And they thrive in combating negative feedback, negative words. Like they really thrive in that environment, and they can really do a great and masterful job of steering conversation. Look, trolling is trolling is trolling. Trolling looks the same on every platform. I have seen, you know, it's not limited to Reddit, it's everywhere. So, but there are some people who are so good at going into those spaces and working those spaces in the way that we would encourage good allies in particular, who are willing to do the emotional labor of doing it, as allies in particular, that I think I'd be really cautious about saying don't, because I think it's about self-care and knowing just where is your limit, and that limit may fluctuate on any given day.
Yeah, and I think both of you make really good points. I mean, my initial response was, I'm not a big fan of Reddit. I don't particularly enjoy it. It's just not for me. And so, I mean, I'm sort of at this point with social media where if I don't enjoy the platform, I just don't want to spend my time there anymore. And it's very much my own personal choice that I engage in other ways. Like if you want to run into me, and not that you can run into me at this point because we're all locked down, but if we met each other and wanted to debate in person, I am your girl. Like I am so there. But there is something that I find infinitely frustrating about these spaces. And I think the part that frustrates me most of all is someone who frankly doesn't care what people are saying about me. It frustrates me seeing how it affects other people and feeling largely powerless in many cases. And I mean, and this was a case where people, even the moderators in many respects, were powerless to actually affect anything in there. And so I tend to be one of those people who is just like, well, it's, you know, I know there's issues in there. I know there are alternatives for me. And so I'm going to go to those places. And yet I completely agree with what Jamel is saying in that we as a community have always, you know, all marginalized people have had to fight for their space. And it is not an appropriate response to say, well, we're just going to withdraw from this. Because I know there have been a number of efforts to start like a queer Facebook and a queer Twitter and a queer this and a queer that is just dedicated to us and to our allies. And I also don't think that that's the answer either. I think it is somewhere in between. But I think, Liz, the point that you were making is critical, which is you need to know what you can handle. You need to know if you're the person who can dive into those subreddits and read them and it doesn't really affect you, or you're able to respond to them and you're able to be effective. And I'm not sure that everybody necessarily, and I especially worry about younger people who are more vulnerable, necessarily have completely sort of thought this out completely and recognize how damaging some of that can be, even if you don't realize it. And I think that article that came out about a year ago about moderators on Facebook was really proof positive that even just being exposed to some of this stuff poses psychological risk for people. And again, I'm not suggesting running in the other direction because that's not what we do. We fight. But I think there need to be some sort of parameters and guidance around it. So I want to, two quick things. First of all, for people who are on the chat, we definitely want you to be part of the conversation. I'm able to see some of those comments going by, but not really read them while we go. So please make sure that you are giving us your comments. And if you have any questions for my two guests today, who clearly know more about this than I do, so please keep doing that and who are more passionate about this. If we could go back to queer culture from last week, I'll be much, much better.
One thing, Jean Marie, I know we're going to comments and questions. I do also want to uplift one thing I love about Reddit, which is, so I am the PFLAG Redditor. I am the person who runs our account. And I mostly go in there to be PFLAG's warm voice when it's needed or warranted. People ask questions, and it happens constantly, more than I even realized. But there are really wonderful things that happen on Reddit too, like lots of great interactions with parents, where that's where they will go to find LGBTQ youth that they can ask questions to. I think my kid is LGBT. I don't know what to do. And the responses are loving and caring and comforting and funny. And so I also would hate to say there is just one problematic platform. This obviously was one scenario in one situation, but there are also some really great things that happen.
Oh, yeah, and that is totally true. And unfortunately, the stuff that gets the press, as it always does, is the really bad stuff. So, and there is a huge amount of content there. I mean, as Jamel points out, anything you're interested in, you can, in fact, find other people on Reddit who have already written about it. So I want to ask you both, before we go to comments and questions, we've been talking about Reddit, but what I'd love to hear is, what are some other places that you both love for going online and for sort of these interactions? And we'll do selfless PFLAG promotion really soon. But Jamel, do you want to go first?
So I was a pretty early adopter of social media. I've been on social media easily the last 20 years, which is weird to consider. I feel like I use each social media platform for something different. Facebook is for me to keep in contact with friends and family, people that I've met along the way that I may not be able to, get to at an arm's reach. Twitter for me is where I go to be funny and ridiculous and to connect with people, to keep up with all the memes. Reddit is where I go to learn stuff. It just kind of depends on what I'm feeling, but I'm pretty active on most social media platforms.
You'll go everywhere is your advice.
Yeah.
Liz, what about you? Places that you love?
Yeah, so actually I'm the same way. I'm also was an early adopter. That's frightening. And for PFLAG, we're on all spaces. The one that we have not, and so we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, and it really does depend on my mood. And, we use each platform for something really different. And our voice on each platform is a little different, appropriately. The one place we have not gone yet, and it's social, it's considered social, but that has been traditionally challenging for the LGBTQ community is TikTok. TikTok has very challenging issues around the LGBTQ community. There's a lot of youth there. Would be wonderful to be able to reach them. We've only dipped a toe, but we're doing it really cautiously because there's been so much problematic material there. So. Yeah.
And I think all these sites kind of make the case as to why it's important for those of us who are on these sites to be really strong and interactive, and especially our allies to do this, because often, allies are occupying spaces that we don't. And I think it's amazing seeing some of these challenges and not necessarily finding these safe spaces has led to the developments of things like QChat, which is done through Centerlink and a couple of other organizations, and PFLAG's involved in that. And that created a very dedicated safe space. Gender Spectrum has its own chat rooms, and our PFLAG Connects program, which brought our chapter network online, created a social space for people that is very PFLAG moderated, run by our actual chapters. So it gives people some alternatives. So I want to ask Jamie if she would come back to us for a second, because I saw that we've had a lot of hellos from people around the country. And Jamie, if we had any comments or questions in the air that we should talk about.
Yeah. I'm going to pull up one question here. Somebody was wondering if social media platforms are not regulating these spaces and not regulating themselves, do you all think that it would be appropriate or legitimate for us to organize these types of brigades on homophobic or transphobic or any of the ism environments that exist out there?
I'm going to try to pretend I'm not looking at Andy's picture, which seems unconvinced that we might be able to do that.
What do you guys think?
I think it would be hard. I think, we have to remember too that not every account has a human behind it, right? There are bots and there are trolls and there are algorithms, and they're all they're hard to combat and they change constantly. I think it could be done, but I think it would be hard because there's just so much about this that is not really run by humans.
Jamel, what do you think?
I agree with Liz. What I will say is I 100% appreciate the platform. I'm sorry, like the corporations or the entity on social media that do have humans behind, because it has produced some of the best online entertainment content ever to exist on the internet. I know Target ran a commercial where there was someone in a same-sex relationship. Someone commented, "How could you do this? Raw anger." And a live person like clapped back in a way that was like engaging but funny, but also brought to attention like, "Hey, you might want to think differently about this." So I always appreciate those companies that do the live moderation and response.
Netflix did a similar thing with that. Netflix really clapped back at someone. I don't know if you all saw, I'm trying to remember the show was, but it was saying every time Netflix has a show and here's the gratuitous gay character.
Yeah.
Netflix was all over that. It was fantastic.
Yeah.
And I think that it sort of speaks that there needs to be a human element here. And that's actually part of the conversation about this, that so much of it is automated, that having those people there becomes really, really critical in the conversation. Hinkle, what else do we have? Anything else?
Well, and I was going to throw out from the article itself. I mean, one of the complaints that these moderators had that it took 125 of them coming together to get a human response to this situation. So I just wanted to throw that out there as well. We also had a question for somebody, which is like a big philosophical question, which is wondering what you all think the role of a private company to determine sort of what is or what isn't free speech, what is or what isn't hate speech. Like, in your minds, how does that work?
And go ahead and answer it in 30 seconds.
I literally we can totally tackle that in the next 2.5 minutes.
We're about to solve big problems, people. I hope everyone's watching.
I don't know if it's their job to define, like, that's something that like the Constitution would do, right? Or like the government. But like, I do think it's their job to at least give us a framework or a list of guidelines on how to access the site or how to like interact with each other. Like, give us the 10-point Bill of Rights on how to interact on this Reddit thing, which Reddit actually does. For every subreddit, there is on the right-hand side a list of guidelines on do's and don'ts. But like, that's something that should be done on all platforms,
Liz? Anything?
Yeah, I mean, same thing. I think one of the hardest things about Facebook, for example, is they have this list of what they say it is, but it's sometimes unclear. Like, one of the things that I think is great about Reddit, it is right there. It is really clarifying. Facebook, they're constantly working to get it right. I know because I work with them. I will assume good intentions, at least based on the people I work with, that they're trying to get it right. But it changes constantly. And I think some of it has to change constantly because the world is changing in this regard constantly.
It is. And, and I think one of the challenges is, and I think this goes to the question about, can we sort of respond, can we create our own brigades if we wanted, is how do you do these things in a way that does not mirror the behaviors of those who attack us? Because I think there is a fine line between defending yourself and starting to actually yourself practice exclusionary and abusive behavior. I mean, and even though it feels righteous because, you're saying the right thing, there is sort of the guidance to do things with love. And it's hard to do that in these environments. And I think that it's very easy to slip into acting like those who torture you.
And it's actually a flag ideal of conversation. Social media is not conversation as much as we would like it to be. It devolves rapidly.
It does. And unfortunately, we are just about out of time again. So Liz, Jamel, Jamie, I want to thank you for doing this. We actually had disagreement. This made me so excited. We always agree on things. So this is fantastic. So thank you for all of this. And for everybody who's been participating online, it's really hard to read all the comments as we're talking, but I see your names and I'm so grateful to all of you for showing up. And for participating in our discussions. Remember, you can have this conversation at home if you go to straightforequality.org and click on the discussion series. Next week, we are going to be back next Thursday, same bat time, same bat channel. We are going to be talking about LGBTQ people who are Muslim. And we have two really great guests, and I'm super excited. So as we close out every single time, in the words of the doctor, run fast, laugh hard, and be kind. It is the most important thing for us. Thank you so much for being with us for Something to Talk About. I'm Jean Marie Navetta from PFLAG, and we will see you next week.